Happy Sunday, everyone. I titled this rather provocatively, "Is the Word of Wisdom Wrong?" for a reason. And it's because, like what I've discussed in past weeks, it also applies here. I think there's a difference between doctrine, what God has actually said, and what our church culture would have us believe. And I think when it comes to the word of wisdom, there is so much cultural baggage that comes into play. I mean, profoundly so. So much so that few people actually read the actual word of wisdom in trying to look at what the answer actually is. And so I want to go through on this episode of Sunday Musings. What does the word of wisdom actually say? Why was it not a commandment? Is it a commandment today? And if so, when and why? But then also the actual intent versus the cultural interpretation and all this baggage that we put onto it. And also, I'm also so perplexed by the fact that we focus on the thou shalt nots almost entirely, exclusively. So rarely do we ever consider the thou shalts. We measure the compliance with the word of wisdom based on a tiny, tiny little subset of things it actually says. And so when we're asked to comply with the word of wisdom, when we're getting a temple recommend interview and we're being asked whether we obey the word of wisdom, the implication of it, our understanding of it is, are you not smoking? Are you not drinking? Okay, good, you're obeying the word of wisdom. And that becomes the extent to which we consider our compliance when it comes to the word of wisdom. So what I have always found so fascinating about the word of wisdom, right, is that it specifically says that it was to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint. Okay, this was intentionally not a commandment. The word of wisdom was not introduced that way. It was not perceived that way. The people who heard it directly from Joseph, right, did not understand it that way. And so at what point, if ever, did the word of wisdom become a commandment? And that's one of the things that I want to unpack, because look, I've never had I've never drunk alcohol in my life. I was, of course, raised in a culture in which that was against the word of wisdom. And I think there's some nuance there that I'll get into in a moment that suggests that's not really accurate. That's not what the word of wisdom actually says. Nevertheless, that's how I was raised. I think the stuff smells bad. I'm also a person who likes being in control of my faculties. And so the idea of being intoxicated or impaired is very unsettling for me. I wouldn't like to not have, full control over myself. So I come at this from the approach of I have no desire to use this stuff. I'm not intending to justify my own desire to, go, have a bottle of whiskey. For me, it's this interesting theological question, again, of trying to separate what God has said from what the culture of the church has kind of caked as layers on top of what God is talking to us about. One of the things that I find interesting when I've kind of studied this over the years and when I talk to other members of the church, there's this idea that Brigham Young once upon a time said that he had gotten all church members to, covenant to obey the word of wisdom, that it became a commandment in the days of Brigham Young when he kind of shifted the church from this idea that it was not a commandment to, in fact, a commandment. And so the question is, where does that come from? Why do people say that about Brigham Young? Well, here is from Joseph Fielding Smith. When he was an apostle, he wrote a set of books, I have them sitting right here, called Answers to Gospel Questions. So as an apostle, here's Joseph Fielding Smith, who, man, I don't remember this and get it wrong. I think he was like Hiram's grandson or something. Anyways, he's down the Smith lineage, right? And so he says this about what I just brought up with Brigham Young. He said, September 9th, 1851, President Brigham Young stated that the members of the church had had sufficient time to be taught the import of this revelation, and that henceforth it was to be considered a divine commandment. This was first put before the male members and then before the women, and by unanimous vote accepted. Aha, so there's our answer. Now we know the point at which the word of wisdom became a commandment, when it changed from the way it was introduced, not by way of commandment, right, to be sent greeting as just an invitation with a promise, to the point where God said, no, you know what, moving forward from now, it's going to be a commandment. We now know, September 9th, 1851, Brigham Young. Except that's not what actually happened. That's not what happened. What Joseph Fielding Smith described, what he wrote, I don't know if he was misinformed, if he was projecting his own whatever onto this. That is not what happened. When you go back into the record about what happened in that conference, so this was reported in the Millennial Star, which was kind of the church's paper at the time. So listen to this and see if you can kind of thread the difference. President Young rose to put the motion and called on all the sisters who will leave off the use of tea, coffee, etc., to manifest it by raising the right hand. It was seconded and carried. In other words, it was the motion was passed. Everyone voted for it. And then, it continues, and then put the following motion, calling on all the boys who were under 90 years of age, who would covenant to leave off the use of tobacco, whiskey, and all things mentioned in the word of wisdom, to manifest it in like manner, which was carried unanimous. Did you catch the difference? At no point in there was President Young attempting to obligate anyone who was not sitting there present to consider this as anything different than it had been considered in decades past. At no point was he claiming revelation. He was not saying this was a commandment for the broader church. It was basically asking the people who were present to offer a personal commitment to abstain from the items condemned by the word of wisdom. Again, it wasn't the focus on the thou shalt, hey, we need to do all these things and eat all these things. It was like, stay away from, tea and tobacco. And so, President Young, what's interesting about him is that nearly a decade after he supposedly declared the word of wisdom to be a commandment, nearly a decade later, he advised the brethren, and here's the quote, if you must use tobacco, put a small portion in your mouth when no person sees you, and be careful that no one sees you chew it. I do not charge you with sin. So if, in fact, President Young in 1851 had shifted the word of wisdom to become a commandment, why then, a full decade later, is he saying something completely at odds with that? Well, the answer is obvious. It's that he was not declaring that a commandment. What Joseph Fielding Smith wrote about in his book is wrong. It is inaccurate. That is not what happened at that 1851 conference. That was merely a personal obligation or a charge to those who were present to basically try and obey the word of wisdom, which had long been the charge. So that is now out of the way. That did not happen. It wasn't 1851. It wasn't Brigham Young, even though for decades and decades and decades since, everyone was claiming, oh, it was Brigham Young. That's who changed it to be a commandment. Now it's a commandment. Now we ought to do it, right? And that simply was not and is not true. And of course, we know this because Joseph Smith himself, right, in 1844, a full 11 years after receiving this revelation of the word of wisdom, is drinking beer, recording it in his journal almost nonchalantly in passing, like it's no big deal, right? Went down to the bar and drank a beer, and then I went off here and did that, right? 11 years after the word of wisdom. And you might say, oh, no, it's because the saints were still needing to warm up to it, and they were so used to it, and they had... This is Joseph Smith we're talking about, right? I might grant you that argument if this was a lay member of the church, or why did President Young cut off the age at 90 in his little personal charge, right? Why not the 91-year-olds? Is this idea that was prevalent with other church leaders as well of let's give a pass to the older folks and let's really focus on the young folks. And so for decades, when the word of wisdom, the kind of anti-tobacco, anti-drinking emphasis in the early 1900s, especially in the late 1800s, when that was really being pushed, the focus was on the young people. They were almost giving this pass to the elderly people, you've been doing it forever, okay, we'll give you a pass, but hey, you young people, you shouldn't be doing it. And so fine, maybe if it was some random other person, I might concede that, okay, the saints had to warm up to this and kind of get over their years of, drinking and tobacco use or whatever. Except, anyways, I won't go off on the tangent. But the point is, this is Joseph Smith we're talking about, the very person who received the revelation. And I don't think you can really say that, he was a flagrant violator of the revelations he was being given. Quite the opposite. He was the one trying to pull up other saints to kind of come to his level and be able to qualify for more revelation for their obedience and fulfilling what God had already said. So it was not perceived as a commandment. There were taverns. I mean, when the saints came to Utah, there were production breweries all throughout the valley, right? I mean, the church owned institutions which had alcohol sales, and like it was just a part of the saints' life. Members of the church drank beer. And so they abstained from the harder drinks. We'll get into that in a moment and the nuance that's there. But there was a clear difference between kind of light beer, you might call it, anyways, we'll get into that. But there's a difference between that and like the hard drinks. And then, I mean, tobacco was its own thing too, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. The point being that it is incorrect to say that in 1851 it was Brigham Young who turned it into a commandment. And so what's very interesting about this topic is that I know of few revelations that have so many vastly differing interpretations. Like, think of what other revelation we've had, modern revelation, that has so much of this like evolving interpretation and differing interpretations that come and go. And I mean, there may be another one out there. There may be something that is like this, but I struggle to think of any other revelation that has just like morphed and people have all these interpretations. And especially so when you go back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, where you look at the journals and the diaries of all these church leaders when Prohibition was going on. I'm going to get into this next. And they just believed all kinds of different things, the top leaders of the church, and they had wild disagreements about what was being prohibited by the word of wisdom. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. What I find really interesting is John Widsoe, who as an apostle wrote a booklet called The Word of Wisdom. And he's a very analytical guy. He was trying to kind of analyze the word of wisdom, stem to stern, and say, here's what this means, here's what this means, right? Really kind of diving in deep. And so here's his interpretation as an apostle, where he was attacking refined flour and foods. What? Right? Like, So I mean, you had people like, wait, are we allowed to have chocolate? Are we allowed to have, certain types of tea and not others? And what about, beer versus hard drinks? And, so John Widsoe still in his 1930 book, he says, all drinks, so he said the word of wisdom also bans all drinks containing substances that are unnaturally stimulating. And that's an important distinction that I'll get into in a moment when we talk about what are hot drinks. So a little bit more of the history before we dive into what the word of wisdom actually says. I think one of the biggest, one of the individuals who was most influential in changing the church's cultural definition or interpretation of the word of wisdom was Heber J. Grant. Heber J. Grant, before he was president of the church, right, as an apostle in the first presidency, was actively campaigning for the temperance movement. And you need to understand something about the temperance movement, the folks that were pushing for prohibition, which passed in 1919 with the 18th Amendment, right, to the Constitution. This was a massive, massive movement. Who was leading that movement? It was the Protestants. It was the other Christians who were swearing off, liquor, swearing off alcohol, right? They were going after young people, trying to make it hip, trying to convince girls to, not drink so that the boys would kind of be enticed not to drink. And this was the temperance movement. Go look it up on Wikipedia. There's a whole big deal here going on. The point is, Latter-day Saints were not leaders of that effort. They were followers. It was the Protestant Christians out there really campaigning heavy to ban alcohol, right, and tie this to kind of their religious movement. And Heber J. Grant was a big believer. He was a prohibitionist. He wanted to use the government to prohibit alcohol. He thought that that was an important thing to do. So much that in 1908, this is a decade before he became president of the church, but he was an apostle. He may have been in the first presidency at the time. I'd have to verify that. But he was at least an apostle. he became a trustee and an officer for the Anti-Saloon League. Okay, this was kind of the organization behind the temperance movement and pushing for prohibition. And so Heber J. Grant, as a top-ranking member of the church, becomes the point person in Utah for this prohibitionist effort. So he's coordinating efforts and messaging and really pushing for this stuff. But what's interesting is that, at the time you got Joseph F. Smith, who is president of the church, and others in the upper echelons of power who favored a more restrained approach when it came to the word of wisdom, who did not favor prohibition. They favored local control. They favored persuasion over coercion. And so there were a lot of church leaders who, yes, felt that the word of wisdom banned, alcohol, for example, or prohibited alcohol, but that they did not feel that it was the government's job to come in and do that. So they didn't really support prohibition. But Heber J. Grant did. He did very, very much so, okay? And that's important to understand because as the 18th Amendment passes, Heber J. Grant is ecstatic. So he became president of the church in 1918, and then the following year is when the 18th Amendment passed, and now we have prohibition. And so he sees the culmination of his efforts and many others throughout the country to really push things in this direction, even though the Latter-day Saints were out, drinking beer and, they did not buy into this Protestant movement until some of their leaders started pushing them in that direction. It was the Protestants that were leading out. And so after alcohol was banned, President Heber J. Grant started turning his attention to tobacco because they say, oh, check, we got alcohol banned. Let's now move to tobacco. Let's enforce the word of wisdom on everyone at the point of a gun, right, through the government. And so in 1921, the first presidency is involved and they're pushing. And church and state was still, very intertwined in Utah. And so they got the legislature to ban tobacco, prohibited in 1921. Problem? Massive disobedience. Did not work at all. They repealed it the next year. You have Grant saying things like this. He says tobacco, quote, destroys the God-given power to bring forth sons and daughters into this world. Okay, interesting. That the first presidency got involved in elections. There were differing, so like the Salt Lake County sheriff, there was this election, for example, there were other elections as well. The Salt Lake County sheriff primarily tasked with enforcement of the laws, and the first presidency under Heber J. Grant did not like one of the candidates who they felt like was taking too passive an approach in enforcing prohibition. And so they got involved in the local election to push the guy who was the prohibitionist and who would crack down. In his journal, Grant talks repeatedly about how he was losing sleep over this issue. Like this was a big, big issue for him. Throughout the 1920s, while Heber J. Grant is president, the church is using tithing dollars to financially support the Anti-Saloon League, which Heber J. Grant had been the kind of trustee and the officer for in Utah. Okay, so then what happens? Well, fast forwarding a little bit, the 18th Amendment is repealed, right? This is done through the 21st Amendment in 1933. So 14 years later, it's repealed, and Grant is ticked, right? Because he feels like the saints didn't listen to him. He has this quote where, I'm not going to pull it up, it's in my book, Latter-day Liberty, but he feels like the church membership wasn't listening to him. He feels like they're not following the prophet. And so he records privately like how frustrating that was, that the church was, in part responsible for voting for repealing the 18th Amendment. Little historical tidbit, a lot of people believe, and it's often said, that Utah was the deciding state to vote for prohibition, to vote for the constitutional amendment that repealed prohibition. That's not actually true. There were two other states that ratified on the same day, and then another state did it the following day. So even had Utah not done it, it still would have been, the 21st Amendment still would have been ratified. So I find it interesting here that, so then you have, this is right around the time 1930. So 1933 is when that prohibition is repealed. And just a few years before that is when John Widsoe is writing his little booklet on the word of wisdom, which I was talking about. And what's interesting is that these two business owners come to President Grant. And they're asking for two things. One is they wanted the First Presidency apparently to invest in their business called Nature Way or Nature's Way. And they were also asking for permission to use John Widsow's tract, his little booklet, in their promotional materials. Perhaps this was kind of the early days of the Mormon MLM, weird incestual business church crap that still happens today. And permission was denied. Why? Because the First Presidency felt that it, quote, First Presidency thought that the church might be criticized because the actual teachings in the word of wisdom would hardly justify the conclusions drawn. So again, what did John Widsow say? No refined flour, no food, all drinks containing substances that are unnaturally stimulating are banned. So John Widsow is kind of getting out there, but he's an apostle. He's this authoritative person writing literally the book on the word of wisdom. It's being promoted all over the place, read widely. It is like, it's like Bruce R. McConkie writing Mormon doctrine, right? It's just got that authoritative weight behind it. Yet the First Presidency is saying that the actual teachings in the word of wisdom would hardly justify the conclusions drawn. And it's so interesting because Heber J. Grant, here's this prohibitionist who feels like prohibition is a good thing. In fact, he said, after prohibition passed, he said that it was the greatest financial and moral blessing that has ever come to humanity. Prohibition. The greatest financial and moral blessing that has ever come to humanity. Like, I don't think it was a financial blessing. I don't think it was a moral blessing, but that's what he felt like after Prohibition. I think the evidence goes against that of how it actually went down. And then after repeal in 1933, here's the quote I was looking for. Grant said that he never felt so humiliated in my life over anything as that the state of Utah voted for the repeal of Prohibition. So there's a lot of weird history here and conflicting interpretations because leaders of the church themselves can't seem to agree in the early days, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, about what is actually prohibited in the word of wisdom. And so much of the emphasis is on, tea and coffee, and then, tobacco, and later was added kind of the illegal drugs or the hard drugs. And so where does this come from? That's an important question. Where do we get this conclusion that hot drinks are tea and coffee? So let's go to D&C 89. This is the word of wisdom. And there's a couple references that are interesting here. So in verse 5, it says, if any man drinks wine or strong drink among you, behold, it's not good, only in assembling yourselves together to offer your sacrament. So here is where it says no wine, unless you're doing it for sacrament. And then in the next verse, it says, you should make it yourselves. We're going to get into why in just a moment, because a lot of people overlook the first few verses that have nothing to do with the actual like food and drink kind of stuff, but is the preface why this word of wisdom was even given in the first place, which is silly for us to overlook. So I want to talk about that. Nevertheless, he's saying, if you want to have wine, don't buy it from other people, make it yourself, and only use it for sacrament. Okay, fair enough. Verse 7. And again, strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies. And then skipping 2 verses down, it says, and again, hot drinks are not for the body or belly. So we've got strong drinks and we've got hot drinks. Strong drinks, I think, are widely understood to be kind of your hard liquors and so forth, right? So it's not for the belly, you shouldn't drink it, but it's for the washing of your bodies. So the very high alcohol content, perhaps you might say, right? Can help disinfect and things like that. So fine, we've got hard liquor that we can use to, sanitize our wounds or things like that, I suppose. But hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. So that's where, again, belly is what we can consume. So we can't consume liquor. We're not going to do the strong drinks. But what about the hot drinks? We're not even supposed to consume the hot drinks. What are hot drinks? Well, the conclusion, it is officially called the official interpretation. So the church in its publication says, and I may have this here somewhere. Okay, so here's from the handbook of the church. I'll probably read the other part in a minute. But here it says, the only official interpretation of hot drinks is the statement made by early church leaders that the term means tea and coffee. That is the only, quote, official interpretation. Okay, so official interpretations, like, I mean, there are differing official interpretations, or there are differing interpretations by different church leaders, or just because something is official does not mean it's divine, and I've gotten onto that and into that in a previous episode. But for purposes of today, let's kind of narrow in on that. So hot drinks are defined as tea and coffee. Why? Why? Like, is it the heat? Or is it the contents? Is it the temperature of the drink that is the issue? Or is it what's inside the drink that, even if cold, would be a problem? So let me ask this question more personally. I returned home from a trip today. I was at the airport, and I was in the Delta Sky Club, and I had a little bit of downtime to eat and relax. And there was a vast array of tea, little tea bag kind of options, right? Different flavors and different things. And knowing that I was going to be talking about this today, I had some tea. So I had a cup of tea. It was this orange citrus herb, whatever, right? Okay, so my question for you is, did Connor break the word of wisdom today? What do you think? I had a hot drink, temperature-wise, and let's say for just a moment that it didn't have caffeine. So it was a non-caffeine version of tea, but it was hot. Did I break the word of wisdom? Is it because of hot drinks? And then if so, why only tea and coffee and not something like hot chocolate or hot apple cider? Okay. So maybe you might say, it's not the temperature, it's what's in it. It's the caffeine, that's what's in common between tea and coffee. And then, okay, well then why not, Coca-Cola? In fact, I mean, there's some interesting history here too. Let me see if I can find it, where there was, in the early days in the early 1900s, when you had all this going on. Here's my note. Heber J. Grant was urging against the consumption of Coca-Cola. And so this is where we get all these interpretations over the decades throughout the 1900s that we shouldn't be drinking caffeine either. I mean, President Hinckley on 60 Minutes also said, we avoid, caffeine. And then, of course, BYU doesn't sell caffeine, and they have the audacity to claim that it wasn't because of church leadership. It was because the cafeteria service, which has the autonomous authority to decide what they offer, doesn't offer or didn't offer caffeinated drinks because there was no demand for it on campus. That's what they claimed a few years ago when asked why BYU doesn't have caffeinated drinks. Give me a break. Anyways, so we have all this like caffeine interpretation, right? And leaders of the church saying you shouldn't have it. There were differing people saying, leaders of the church saying it, the word of wisdom does apply to and prohibit caffeinated drinks. You had more, almost all, saying, well, no, the word of wisdom doesn't prohibit caffeinated drinks, but you shouldn't drink them. And so they weren't claiming that the word of wisdom interpretation included caffeinated drinks, but they were nevertheless kind of layering on their own, Pharisaical, thing on top of what the word of wisdom actually says, to then still say members should abstain from caffeine. And that was the popular message given by church leaders, was abstain from caffeine. That many of them said that. I love the quote from David O. McKay. He was at some kind of social function when he was president, and he was given by the server a cup that had the Coca-Cola branding on it. And the server went up to him and profusely apologized. Again, because this cultural narrative at the time, this understanding of the word of wisdom, was that Coca-Cola should be avoided. Why? Well, because of the word of wisdom. Even though the word of wisdom doesn't actually say that, but you should still avoid it, like this weird, right, in the middle. And so they were apologizing to President McKay, who then said to the server, I don't care what's on the cup as long as Coke is in the cup. And I just think that's amazing, right? Because here's a guy, he's got another story I'll share, where he's pushing back on some of this cultural weirdness stuff. He's the guy who was dressed in white suits. He was really trying to professionalize and modernize the church to kind of pull it out of its weirdness and appeal to modern society. There's a great book called David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, which is very insightful, using a lot of his journals and private correspondence, which is a fascinating peek inside the upper echelons of the church. There's a whole interesting story about how that book even came to be. But if you're interested in church history and some of this cultural stuff, check out David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. I have it, let's see, it's right here. Who's it written by? Hang on. I forget the author's name. Oh yeah, Gregory Prince. Okay, so here it is. David O. McKay. I got my little light reflection there. David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism by Greg Prince and Robert Wright. I'll let you go find the backstory to how this book came to be. It's very fascinating. It probably says it on the Wikipedia page or something. Anyway, so that's David O. McKay. I don't care what's on the cup as long as Coke is in the cup. Pushing back on this cultural interpretation of caffeine and the word of wisdom. He has a funny story too. I think it was at Hotel Utah, which I believe the church owned at the time or had previously owned. And again, he was at a social function and and they were serving dessert. He's president of the church, sitting there at this whole thing, right? And they're handing out the dessert. Well, what is it? It's rum cake. And so they hand out the desserts to everyone. And again, the server comes up, oh my gosh, and we just served rum cake to the prophet, and they go up and they apologize. He's already mid-bite, chewing through this thing. And, they're apologizing. And he's like, what's the big deal? The word of wisdom says nothing about eating alcohol, right? Versus drinking it. So anyways, David O. McKay, cool guy in some regards. But again, so did Connor sin today? I had a hot, temperature-wise hot drink without caffeine, we'll say. I don't think I was breaking the word of wisdom because of the temperature. But then wait a minute, if my hot drink, my tea, was caffeinated, then was I violating the word of wisdom? Well, wait, so is hot caffeine bad, but cold caffeine is fine? I mean, we had Dieter Uchtdorf just a couple years ago, and as I think he was in the counselor of the First Presidency. Maybe he was back as an apostle at that point. But here's this leader of the church admitting that he drank gallons of he called it a diet soda that shall remain nameless. And of course, everyone laughs. And it's this weird, nervous laugh. You remember that, right? When he said that, and everyone's like, oh. And why are they laughing? It's because we all know how stupid this whole thing is. That everyone's got all this weird thing that we know that all these interpretations are bad and it's all silly and ridiculous, but we kind of go along anyways because I want to answer at tithing settlement that I obey the word of wisdom. And so what are hot drinks? Okay, well, if you go back to the 1828 dictionary by Noah Webster, this is the best way to understand what words meant at the time of the Restoration. Noah Webster, it's his first dictionary, 1828. It's a great dictionary to use overall when you're asking yourself questions like this about what do those words mean and what do they mean at the time and in the era in which they were articulated in modern scripture and the revelations of the church. Okay, so what is hot? Well, hot, one of the definitions of hot is stimulating. It's not temperature, it's a stimulant. So if you say that is the meaning of hot, then we have a potential answer to my question. Connor did not, in fact, break the word of wisdom this morning by drinking a hot, temperature-wise hot tea that was not caffeinated. But then when Connor later in the same little cafeteria went and got a cup of Sprite have caffeine? No. Let's just say Coca-Cola, right? Then I'm disobeying the word of wisdom because that's a stimulant. And if true, then John Widsow's analysis actually becomes perhaps relevant, where he says that the word of wisdom bans all drinks containing substances that are unnaturally stimulating. Because if hot drink is a drink with a stimulant, according to Noah Webster, one of his definitions of the word hot, then John Widsow is right. A drink that has a stimulant is bad, which means we shouldn't be having, anything with caffeine in it, regardless of its temperature. We shouldn't be having caffeinated drinks. And the ha interpretations that we're all kind of nervous about, and the swigs and the so deliciouses and all these crazy stores that now exist in Utah because we prefer our caffeine cold to hot, as if that makes any difference at all, right? All of those are wrong. All of those are sins. They're violating the word of wisdom if we indeed believe that hot drinks means a caffeinated drink or a drink with a stimulant. But then I ask, well, wait a minute. It specifically says hot drinks are not for the body or belly. So what if I take a caffeine pill? Or what if I crumble it up and I sprinkle it into my food? Or like, can I eat uh, what otherwise would be a hot drink? Is caffeine okay in a powder form, or a solid rather than like, you see how this kind of gets ridiculous, and it even gets more ridiculous when you think about um, the ridiculousness of the modern interpretation, where it's now tied to the temple recommend, and I'll get to that. So we now classify as righteous someone who is not drinking or smoking, okay? But you can be guzzling all the antidepressants you want and all the energy drinks you want and eating all the processed foods you want, and that's okay. You are righteous if you take these types of stimulants, but not these. And it shows the ridiculousness, the Pharisaical nature with which we treat the word of wisdom. When we nitpick at these thou shalt nots, and we use these official interpretations to thread our way around them to say, oh, well, I'm staying clear afar from, those types of stimulants. I don't go to Starbucks, but I do go to So Delicious, and I'm a righteous Mormon, right? Like that doesn't make any sense at all. And yet that is what we do. That is what our culture does, is we have our own Pharisaical interpretations and official interpretations of revelations that I think are more about the spirit of the law than the letter of the law, right? And so if it is about stimulants, then you might say, well, like, we shouldn't be having caffeinated drinks. Or maybe it's about like things in moderation, right? Maybe it's not about like, binging on things, being able to act instead of being acted upon. You've seen people who are addicted to caffeine. It's possible. It's common when people who have their Starbucks every single morning and they decide to quit caffeine and they get the shakes. That's not good. You are not in control of your own body. You are being acted upon instead of being able to act. I think that's when the problem comes in. Not like this little word wisdom checklist. Like, are you using anything on the banned list? Oh, all the rest of it is okay, because, right? And this came up time and again because church leaders over the decades have constantly been asked about caffeine. And what's the response? It's, oh, the church does not have a position on that. And they would just say it's tea and coffee, and tobacco and drugs. And that's what they would keep saying. Oh, we have no position. We have no position. The church is... But it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, what happened to the Joseph Smith teach correct principles and let people govern themselves? What are the correct principles when it comes to the word of wisdom? Because we've turned it into a little checklist through which you can drive a truck. Because as long as you don't use, these 4 things on the list, you can do anything else you want and be considered a church member in good standing, and no one will bat an eye. And you can be filling your bodies with all kinds of junk and getting morbidly obese and taking all these like pharmaceutical medications and antidepressants and energy drinks to, balance those out. And like, you can be doing all of that and be a faithful temple goer. But heaven forbid you drink beer. And why is that, right? Okay, let's think about that. So we talked about strong drinks and hot drinks. Well, what about this verse? So this is verse 17, okay? I'm going to start with 16, actually. So 16, it says, all grain is good for the food of man. Well, let me pause there. Okay, so hang on. What if you're kind of advocating a gluten-free diet? What if you think grain is bad? I hear a lot of people talking about, wheat and whatever, it makes you really bloated. It's actually really bad for you. You should avoid. Here's God saying all grain is good for the food of man. So are those people who advocate for gluten-free whatever, are they violating the word of wisdom? Should they be denied temple recommends? This is rather explicit. All grain is good for the food of man. That's an interesting thought. Okay, so I'm going to continue. As also the fruit of the vine, that which yieldeth fruit, whether in the ground or above the ground. Nevertheless, wheat for man, and corn for the ox, and oats for the horse, and rye for the fowls, and for swine, and for all the beasts of the field. Again, we like skip over this. We're like, yeah, that doesn't apply to me. Like, we pick and choose our little word of wisdom nuggets that we prefer. And barley for all useful animals, and for mild drinks, as also other grain. Well, what's a mild drink? We talked about strong drinks like liquor and hot drinks like stimulants, in the drinks. Well, what about mild drinks? So here, barley, fermented, hops, like this is beer. This is mild beer. The early saints widely understood that the word of wisdom not only tolerated and allowed for mild drinks, beer, but specifically said that it's a good thing. Like, we don't talk about that. This prohibitionist kind of approach that the Protestants pushed on us, and that Heber J. Grant and his buddies were foisting on everyone else, lumped in every drop of alcohol into one common cup and then banned it. And then ever since Prohibition, right, we've kind of had this church culture of like, this is how we're a peculiar people, right? Because before, it was all the polygamy stuff in 1890 and that baggage for decades. The Reed Smoot hearings were trying to get someone, a Mormon in Congress, and that was crazy controversial. No one's joining the church. We're a bunch of weirdos, blah, blah, blah. All this is happening for like decades. And then comes Prohibition. And suddenly we can show all those other Christians how good a Christian we are. And we're one of you, and we're joining with you in this common cause. And even after Prohibition was repealed and all these other Christians started, drinking and feeling like that was just a crazy, bygone era that we were moving past for broader Christianity, the Mormons kept at it. They doubled down on it. And this became how the church identified itself as a peculiar people. Now, when the missionaries went out 2 by 2, it was, oh, there's those, straight edge kids, those clean kids from Utah who don't, smoke or drink. And that became what we were known for. It's what we're known for today, right? I was just at a conference in Phoenix and I had like 2 people asking me, everyone's drinking, like, oh yeah, you're Mormon, right? You don't drink. Like, that is what they know about us. That is our peculiarness. Except the problem is we should be a peculiar people, not because of these outward manifestations of our actions, of what we do and don't do. We should be a peculiar people about who we worship, what we believe, what we stand for, what we promote, the values, the ideas. So again, like the Lord, looketh on the heart, right? And so we substitute for the inner stuff, the outer stuff that's easy to control, just like the Pharisees. We're no better than them. We criticize them all the time. We think they're a bunch of like ignoramus, idiots for like doing what they did. And yet we're doing the same thing. We are avoiding the hard stuff. We are not working on ourselves and our beliefs and our values and our spirituality. We're instead settling for a definition of religion that focuses on outward behaviors. We're tying our religiosity and our position in the church to these outward manifestations and checklists about what we do and do not do. And I think that is spiritually dangerous. I don't think that there's no place for it. I think checklists can be healthy. I think some rules are important. I'm not against all of this. The point is that the Joseph Smith era teaching correct principles and let them govern themselves allows for more agency, allows for adaptation to individual circumstances. It focuses the discussion on the principles so that those aren't lost, right? And recognizes that different people are going to choose different things, and yet as long as the principles are tying us together, as long as our focus is on the values and the ideas and the principles, right, we're going to land just fine. But when we avoid the principles and focus on the minutia and focus on the checklist and focus on the thou shalt nots instead of the thou shalts, I think we start to lose our way. So what does this mean? This means, I think, that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can and perhaps even should drink mild drinks. Verse 17, all these things are for man and these animals, right? And then barley for mild drinks and other grain. I don't see a way around that. And that's how it was for like the first century of the church. It was widely understood. You had righteous Latter-day Saints up and down the valley drinking beer and brewing, their hops, or I don't know all the lingo. I don't do this stuff. Maybe I should. I had my tea today. Maybe I'll go out and buy. I don't even know where I would go or what I would buy. But the point is, it's allowed. And yet we operate in a culture in which it isn't. And I think that is a problem. I don't think that's what the word of wisdom actually says. I mean, go read section 89 yourself when we get done. And focus on all the thou shalts, the things that we're supposed to eat, the things that we're supposed to do. We don't talk about that at all. When was the last time your bishop sat you down and at tithing settlement, talking about the word of wisdom or talking over the pulpit and said, you know what, congregation, like, we're not eating meat sparingly enough. I've seen half of you at R&R barbecue down the road, and that, Ward barbecue we had just the other night, and, meat this, meat that. Like, when was the last time we had a conversation about all the scriptures about meat? We conveniently overlook that because that's socially acceptable, right? I mean, I like meat too. But we overlook that. We compartmentalize. We don't even talk about that. It's so easy to fixate ourselves on how we stand apart and are peculiar. And look at me, I obey the word of wisdom because I'm not smoking cigarettes and, drinking whiskey. Good for you. But how about we talk about like what's in the word of wisdom and what it actually focuses on the things that we should actually be doing. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the handbook, right? Because I read that the only official interpretation of hot drinks is the statement made by early church leaders that the term means tea and coffee. Let's sidestep that because we talked about hot, talked about stimulants. Maybe it means caffeine. Maybe some of these things aren't as big a deal as we think they are. Who knows? Because again, like stimulants in solid form versus, again, we got to focus on the principles. I think that's what the word of wisdom is trying to push us towards and not creating these Pharisaical checklists that we have to follow. But here's how the handbook continues. This is from 2010. It may have been updated slightly since then. I wrote down an old version because of the book that I had it in. Members, I think this largely is the same, if not actually the same. So this is the second paragraph under word of wisdom. Members should not use any substance that contains illegal drugs, nor should members use harmful or habit-forming substances except under the care of a competent physician. So that is the kind of handbook position, the official church position on the word of wisdom. It's, hot drinks means tea and coffee. Don't use any substance that contains illegal drugs. And you shouldn't use harmful or habit-forming substances except under the care of a competent physician. So when you talk to people about the word of wisdom, that's basically what it is. Don't, use tea and coffee and tobacco and illegal drugs. Because the handbook here says that you shouldn't use illegal drugs. Well, what about cannabis? I mean, we dealt with this when we were pushing to legalize cannabis for medicinal use in Utah. Members of the church were freaking out, and the church was attacking our proposition, and we had to go into negotiations with the church. And, it's very interesting. I can only say a little bit here. I'm not going to reveal everything I know because of some confidence, things shared in confidence. But you remember that I was talking about Heber J. Grant and how involved he was in the temperance movement and pushing the church in favor of prohibition. That he was an officer and a trustee for the Anti-Saloon League and so forth. President Nelson, so some people, when we were pushing for Prop 2, the Medical Cannabis Initiative in Utah, there were questions about, does President Nelson know what's going on? And was he involved or whatever? So remember, President Nelson, maybe not remember, most people don't know, he was the president of the Utah Medical Association. And the main opponent, other than the church, to our efforts to legalize medical cannabis in Utah was the Utah Medical Association, of which he was a former president. And they were kind of the ringleaders in opposition. But to answer the question, did President Nelson know? Was President Nelson involved? Excuse me. I'm not going to share the details, but I can resoundingly and assuredly answer an emphatic yes to that question. He was directly involved in deciding what the church's position would be on the medical cannabis initiative. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say there. So the point is that from my perspective, again, going back to what I talked about in a previous episode, here's President Nelson, who has his own kind of pharmaceutical-oriented, medical doctor-oriented training, and marijuana is, an illegal drug, and we should only use pharmaceuticals and what doctors can prescribe, and blah, blah. Like, we're humans. We operate with the bias that we have. And so here he is as the former president of the Utah Medical Association. I think he comes from that perspective, and I think he brought that perspective with him in how he was involved in what we were doing on Proposition 2. And so again, like, members should not use any substance that contains or is illegal drugs. Why are we outsourcing our decision-making to politicians? They decide what illegal drugs are. If they tomorrow said that caffeine is banned, okay? I mean, that's possible. That could be done. So now that's an illegal drug. And so the church's interpretation of the word of wisdom is that because politicians decided what is an illegal drug, now God says that that's bad? I mean, what about mushrooms? There are mushrooms all over this world that have various psychedelic properties within them, so-called magic mushrooms. Chief among them, psilocybin, that has a transformatively positive impact on those with anxiety and depression. Is it against the word of wisdom to use a magic mushroom, to consume psilocybin that can help you in ways far superior than all the antidepressants that people are guzzling? Are the pharmaceutical drugs okay just because a doctor has blessed them, but the natural God-given substance is sinful? Because again, we shouldn't use any substance that contains illegal drugs. It's like rated R movies when the church forever was going against rated R movies and leaders were saying no rated R movies. I always struggled with that, both because, I loved The Matrix and Gladiator and all these movies in the 90s when, that were rated R that I watched. We all did. But I hated it because I don't want to outsource my decision making to the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association. Why should they get to decide what I believe is morally appropriate for me to view? I don't want to let them dictate what is or is not rated R, and suddenly my spiritual fidelity to what the prophet has said is outsourced to the decision making of like some random group that I don't even know about. So too with illegal drugs. I mean, all drugs used to be illegal. What about Oregon? Right now you're in Oregon. Is it the church's position that you can use psilocybin, for example? You might say, okay, well, it's illegal federally. Great, take someone in a different country. There are many countries that don't ban these things. So then God says it's okay to use a mushroom in, I don't know, Venezuela or Antarctica or an island in the middle of the sea, right, where it's not illegal. But then the moment you step foot in Utah or wherever, then you're violating the word of wisdom if you use that mushroom because you're horribly depressed. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I don't think God works that way. So I've never liked this part of the handbook that layers this weird thing on top of the word of wisdom that says illegal drugs. Because again, we're outsourcing the decision making to someone else. That is not a principle, right? Teach them correct principles, let them govern themselves. This is a Pharisaical kind of thing. Okay. Nor should members use harmful or habit-forming substances except under the care of a competent physician. How do you define competent physician? I think through this whole COVID thing, we know a number of incompetent physicians. So do they need to be a physician or do they have to be a competent physician, right? And gosh, I know physicians who will write me a prescription for whatever I want, right? Suddenly, is that okay? God's okay if I just guzzle drugs that someone wrote on a piece of paper? Here, Connor, go have these opioids or whatever, right? And why at all? I don't need a middleman between me and God. I don't need a doctor. If I think that through my own research, if I think that substance can help me, I ought to be able to use it. The government shouldn't stand in my way. My doctor shouldn't stand. This whole pharmaceutical system with gatekeepers is problematic. It can be helpful in many ways. Don't get me wrong, because, an hour on WebMD doesn't make you an expert. It's helpful to have the input of a physician. But we know how this goes. It's a ruse. These doctors are being pushed these drugs by pharmaceutical companies and their sales reps about how great these are. And hey, you get bonuses if you give prescriptions for these drugs. It's a racket in so many places. Not all physicians are like this, but many are. And so suddenly it's okay to use that drug that doctor knows very little about. Think about the vaccine, right? Like doctors don't even know what's in it, and yet they're like, oh, this is safe and effective. And you don't know what's in it. You don't have clinical studies. You don't have long-term studies or anything. So doctors, as I've come to learn things, know very little. They might specialize in their field and then know a lot about a little, but they don't know about every drug. They don't know the history. The new drugs, are you kidding me? They can't keep up. So I don't like this either. Saying that we should only use harmful or habit-forming substances, by the way, that includes caffeine. That's a habit-forming substance. So are they saying we should only go to swig if we call our doctor first and ask that, hey, I'm about to use a habit-forming substance. I got a 64-ouncer from the gas station. Just wanted to check in with you. I don't need a physician to tell me what I can benefit from or what I should be allowed to have. I don't want to outsource my thinking, my decisions to someone else. I would love their counsel. It's like with the government, right? All this COVID crap. They should be informing us of risk and providing data and letting people make their own decisions. We're friggin' adults, for heaven's sake, right? Let us make the decisions. Let us govern ourselves. Teach us correct principles, all you want. I don't think the government is capable of doing that, but religious leaders, sure. Doctors, great. Empower us with information and let us decide. Okay, all right. So I want to end here, probably end, at the first part of the word of wisdom. This is the part we skip over. This is the part I find fascinating. Okay, this is, I'm just going to read the first few verses. And it's like, we don't even read this. A word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland and the church and also the saints in Zion, to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint. We read this part already, right? But by revelation and the word of wisdom, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so verse 4. Behold, verily thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs, which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation. That's interesting. Why was the word of wisdom given? It was because of evils and designs that then existed and will exist, in the future, today, in the hearts of conspiring men. And for that reason, we were given the word of wisdom as a warning. Why? Why do you suppose, what is it about the word of wisdom that protects us from the evil designs of people in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days? You might say, oh, alcohol. Man, people have been drinking, since time immemorial. I don't think it's the alcohol thing. Tobacco's long existed. Okay, like drugs, we got hard drugs now, really hard drugs, but like that's not even in the word of wisdom. If anything, a little bit of the opposite is there, right? Every herb hath God ordained for the constitution of man. Where's that? That's, let's see. That was, verse 10. All wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. We use, in fact, I remember, I know who this is. I don't know if it's publicly known, but when we were doing Prop 2, he put up a billboard in Salt Lake right as you're getting off the freeway, and it had that verse in there because he was ticked that the church was opposing what we were doing. And so he put in big letters on the billboard, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. So you might argue like, okay, maybe there's something there about, what does herb mean? I mean, we can go look up the 1828 dictionary to see how expansive the term herb was intended to be. But the point is that like maybe some kind of drugs are okay. God has, I think, given mushrooms. Cannabis is really interesting because its main properties, these cannabinoids, literally connect with our cell receptors. Our cells have receptors for cannabinoids. We naturally produce cannabinoids in our bodies. And so it's like, here's this amazing plant that God has given us to supplement what we naturally produce. Maybe we're deficient, maybe we need whatever, right? And like that to me is amazing. It's inspiring that God has done something like that. And I believe cannabis is a plant from God, as are all plants. So I think that we should be allowed to use it. You could argue the same with mushrooms and psilocybin, right? And like these benefits that it can bring people. And so then maybe not drugs. So then what are these evil designs that exist in the hearts of men at the time back then? So again, this applied at the time it was given in 1833 and today. Well, that's interesting, right? That's really interesting to me. Because I think you could make an argument that Big Pharma is part of this, that people have become so hopelessly dependent on these pharmaceuticals, and then more pharmaceuticals for the side effects to the first ones, and this dependency on all these medications. And look at how much Pfizer and all their buddies are making. Moderna, like this massive wealth transfer to Big Pharma, right? I mean, you go read the scriptures and it's about power and wealth. That is what evil people have all been about. And so we have power and control and political flexing of muscle and crackdowns and expansion of executive authority and all these things. And we have this massive transfer of wealth to the pharmaceutical companies, right? You could argue the same thing with all the different drugs and everything. So I'm not saying conclusively that that's what this is about. I think you can make a very good argument that they are one of the players that God maybe had in mind, that we need to be healthy. God has given us natural remedies. Like we should be taking care of our bodies so that we don't have to then be dependent. Again, act and not be acted upon. If we can't act if we can't act independently, then we are not fulfilling the measure of our creation. We are not doing what God wants us to be able to do. Because the antithesis, being acted upon, if we are dependent upon our caffeinated drink or our antidepressants or our another idea just came and slipped my mind, right? But like if we can't do it without all these drugs, and we can't operate, we can't, like, again, I don't want to be insensitive. I know there are people with very real medical, physical and mental health needs who are basically incapacitated without medication. I'm not saying that all pharmaceuticals are evil. I'm not doing anything like that, right? There's a time and a need and a season for all the things, etc. But clearly there's a spectrum. Clearly there are people who are, hooked on their monster drinks, right? Or who are way too hooked on the pharmaceuticals that they're doing, who are not doing the work themselves. I mean, look at COVID, right? It's all about, the injection. I probably triggered when I said the V word earlier, and now Facebook's going to add some disclaimer thing on the bottom of this video. So this whole thing has been about like, oh, let's get these drugs. That's how we're gonna. It's like, go for a walk in the sunlight, do exercise, eat well, take care of your body. God has given us these immune systems that are wonderful. Yeah, sometimes you'll get sick and die. That's life. It happens all the time. But like, to not talk about the good things we should do and instead turn to just drugs to be our saving grace, I think it is almost like a false God. And we don't look to God and these bodies and their natural abilities that he's blessed us with. I think we are performing a bit of idolatry when we turn to the flesh of man to save us, when we turn to these mortal, concoctions and whatnot. And again, First Presidency called the vaccine a literal godsend, and I don't know that I agree with that, but you can make the case that many of these medications are godsends, that God has given us the technology and the innovation and the knowledge to create penicillin, right? Like, awesome. So again, this is not anti-drug necessarily, but it's anti-dependence on drugs. It's I'm against treating pharmaceuticals as our path of saving us, of being our kind of soul support physically and even kind of mentally as well. So evil designs. I think it's processed food in a way. You could argue that, right? Like the food industry, the nutrition levels of our food. I mean, the obesity epidemic. I think of, what was that movie? With the little like alien robot, and everyone was morbidly obese, sitting in chairs, like drinking drinks, and had like VR goggles or whatever. I can't remember, some like futuristic Disney movie or whatever. I know the name; it's like on the tip of my tongue. But like everyone's just morbidly obese. They can't do anything, I mean, so you look at the end of the word of wisdom, right? And run and not be weary, walk and not faint. And I think there's a spiritual aspect of that, of course, too. But like, I think that's also physical. God wants us to be able to act, to do things with our bodies, not just like sit there lethargically and, be incapacitated. Because then what good are we? We're just dependent upon other people, and we can't be a tool in his hands to go do amazing things, right? Nephi, when he broke his bow, had to go up on the mountain. He had to go make a new bow, and and then he built a boat, and he did all these things. Like, we are instruments in God's hands when we can actually do things. And I think that's why our bodies are so amazing. They're gifts from God, and we have to treat them well. So again, like, this is kind of speculation. It's the secret combination, whatever, these evil and designs. But when I think of the word of wisdom, I don't really think God cares if I had, Barks root beer with caffeine in it, that I have it like once a month, if that, right? Or I had some tea this morning, right? Or if I drank a beer, which I don't plan to, sounds kind of gross, but I would feel fine telling the bishop at the end of the year, like, yep, I obeyed the word of wisdom, because it says here to have, barley and mild drinks, and I went and did that. So I'll report back another time if I ever do that. I have no desire. Sounds gross. But I would feel, like I am being righteous and obedient or whatever by still doing it. But again, like, the word of wisdom should also be about the thou shalts. There are things that we should be doing. And we don't pay attention to any of that, just like we don't focus on the meat stuff. And so it actually makes me wonder and worry that if this is a principle given with a promise, if it's an invitation, I still don't think it's a commandment. I mean, I didn't even get into the history about how it became tied to the temple commandment with Heber J. Grant, right? And this guy was like a crusader. And so initially it was all very laissez-faire and late. It was all encouraging. Hey, hey, young men, hey, young women, abstain from this, don't do that. But there was a lot of discretion. There was a lot of permissiveness, you might call it, where leaders of the church were kind of understanding and tolerated people who were doing stuff. It wasn't this hard line. But, with Grant came the hard line where they started tying it to the as a condition of temple attendance. So I don't know from my research that it ever became a commandment. I don't see here where God really cares if you know, again, like I know people who drink and even smoke who are way more God-fearing and loving, following the two greatest commandments, right? Way better than many members of the church who Pharisaically, look at the thou shalts and say, oh, okay, I can kind of be whatever and blah, and as long as I don't smoke and drink, I can just kind of go about my life. And they don't focus on the greatest commandments. They don't really, yeah, you know what I'm going to say. I've said it enough times already. It's so fascinating to me, though, this cultural issue that we have. I have this list, okay? So here's my little remarkable, and here's my list of all these different topics that I've thought of so far, and I've done these 4 so far. And so many of these issues are cultural. They are what I believe to be misinterpretations of church doctrine, of reading things into the scriptures that aren't there, of decades-long tradition, the traditions of our fathers seeping into the church. I mean, this whole prohibition stuff was driven by the Protestants. Had it not been for the temperance movement, members of the church would probably still be drinking beer today and be a-okay on their, temple recommend interviews. And again, like I see some people going to the temple that I'm like, like, just because you don't smoke and drink, like I see what you consume and what you're doing with your body and to your body, and it just makes me question things a little bit. That our judgment is a bit off, the criteria is kind of messed up, that we're not focused on the principles, that we're getting into ticky-tacky minutia, that tea and coffee are how we define hot drinks, but hey, caffeine is okay and energy drinks are fine. And like the problem with defining hot drinks in that way is that whatever you don't include is inherently excluded, right? So if you say tea and coffee, then people are like, oh, what about this? And what about that? What about postum? What about, O'Doul's or whatever? Like, what about, herbal tea versus green tea? Like, it just becomes ridiculous. And it focuses us on the wrong questions. That is the biggest problem I have. It focuses us on the wrong questions. We're nitpicking, we're straining at gnats, wondering about, can I be considered a good member of the church and drink this? Like, give me a break. I don't think God cares, right? Go love your neighbor, go do a service project, pray hard, read your scriptures, love your spouse, love your kids, be a good person, and, drink as many of those as you want. Like, I just don't believe that Heavenly Father is sitting there with a checklist to see, like, if we had a stimulated drink or not, and if that's the kicker. And rant. Have a good Sunday. See you guys next week.